At Christmas dinner, I wasn't offered a seat. My daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "We told you not to come." My son looked away and said nothing. So I walked in anyway, placed the apple pie I'd baked on the edge of their perfect table, and slid a red envelope toward him. He opened it, read in silence, and turned pale, then red with fury. His wife screamed, "You're kicking us out of this house!" I looked at them, calm, steady, and simply said, "You told me I wasn't family anymore. I'm just doing what an outsider would do." And what happened next changed everything. I used to think that love, when poured generously and without condition, would always come back to you. That it would fill your life in return, like sunlight coming in through every window. For most of my life, that belief carried me. Through the quiet moments, the sacrifices, the years of doing more with less. But life, I've come to understand, has its own rhythm. And sometimes even the deepest kind of love goes unanswered. My name is Florence Hayes. I'm a widow in my early 60s, though most days I still feel like the 20-year-old girl who fell in love with her high school sweetheart, built a life from scratch, and dreamed only of raising a kind and capable child. That child was Ethan. My son, my world, my reason for pushing through every tired morning and every long night. There was no plan B in my life. It was always Ethan. When my husband passed away after a long illness, I kept our little bakery going for a few more years. Not because I loved baking, though I did, but because it was what we built together, and letting go of it felt like erasing a part of him. Eventually, my knees ached too much from standing all day, and the early morning hours grew heavier on my bones. So I sold the shop and tucked the money away, thinking maybe one day it could help Ethan and his family when they needed it. That day came sooner than I expected. Ethan had met a young woman named Sophia during grad school. She was poised, confident, full of ideas and ambition. I was thrilled for him. Truly. I welcomed her with open arms, made her favorite lemon bars from scratch the first time she came to dinner, and even offered up my late husband's watch as a gift for Ethan to wear on their wedding day. It was my way of saying, "You're not losing a mother. You're gaining another." After the wedding, Ethan and Sophia wanted to buy a home in a newer suburb with good schools and walking paths. It was a beautiful little neighborhood, but the down payment was just out of reach. That's when I offered to help. I sold the small condo I had moved into after selling the bakery, cashed in part of my retirement, and added the difference. "It's not just money," I told Ethan. "It's your start." I didn't want anything in return. Truly, I didn't. Just the occasional dinner together. Maybe a phone call once a week. A birthday celebration that didn't feel like an afterthought. Nothing grand. Just the kind of presence a mother quietly longs for after giving everything she's had. At first, it felt like it might be that way. They invited me over a few times. We ate takeout at the kitchen island. Sophia was polite, if a bit distant, and Ethan always made sure I got a slice of whatever cake they had in the fridge. Then Lily was born, my beautiful granddaughter with the softest cheeks and a laugh like wind chimes. I spent countless nights rocking her to sleep when they were too tired to stand. I held her when she had colic, sang to her in the same off-key voice I once used with Ethan. I remember one night in particular. Sophia had a migraine, Ethan had work in the morning, and Lily wouldn't stop crying. I walked the hallway with her for nearly 3 hours, whispering stories and humming lullabies. When she finally drifted off, I sat down on their couch, cradling her against my chest, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Belonging. Like maybe, just maybe, I had found my place again. But things began to change after that. Little things at first. Sophia started pointing out how I folded the towels incorrectly, or that Lily didn't need so much sugar in her applesauce. She'd sigh when I showed up with groceries unannounced, or mention how their parenting style was intentional and less old-fashioned. One afternoon, I overheard her talking on the phone. I wasn't meant to hear it, but I did. She's just always here, she said. I get that she means well, but it's like she thinks this is still her house. That night I went home and sat in my silent apartment trying to figure out when I'd become too much. I'd thought I was being helpful. Thought I was doing what mothers do. But maybe I was wrong. Still, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to rock the boat. Instead, I pulled back. I stopped dropping by unannounced. I asked before visiting. I started baking only when they requested it. I tried in every small way I could to be less. Sophia's comments didn't stop. Once when Lily ran into my arms squealing grandma at a family picnic, I saw Sophia's expression tighten. Later, she pulled Ethan aside, and when they returned, he gently told me not to encourage too much dependency. I nodded. I smiled. I folded the blanket neatly and left early. Then came the money. Bills they couldn't quite cover, home repairs they weren't prepared for. I helped each time quietly without fanfare. I paid the property taxes 1 year when Ethan forgot. I replaced the leaking roof. I covered an unexpected medical bill for Lily. They thanked me, but always in passing, like it was expected, not appreciated. Eventually it became clear I wasn't a mother anymore. I was a utility. And yet I kept giving, because that's what I knew how to do. I told myself that love was shown in action, not in how others responded. I told myself that my reward was Lily's laughter, the home I helped keep warm, the sense that I was still part of something that mattered. But somewhere along the line, something shifted. It was a quiet shift. So quiet I almost missed it. The way Ethan stopped returning my calls right away. The way Sophia would subtly block my suggestions during family planning. The way I was never asked to join for holidays anymore, just told after the fact what had happened. One afternoon I dropped off Lily's birthday present on their porch, wrapped in soft pink paper with a hand-knit sweater tucked inside. I waited for a message that never came. Days passed. No thank you. No photo. No mention. I started to wonder if they'd even opened it. It wasn't a single moment that broke me. It was the accumulation of small silences. The realization that I had slowly, carefully, and lovingly built a bridge to my son's world. Only to find the other side had quietly been dismantled. I wasn't angry. Not yet. But I was starting to understand that love given freely can still be taken for granted. And the worst part, you don't even see it happening, until suddenly you're standing on that bridge alone. Christmas was always my favorite season. Not because of the lights or the music, though I loved those things too, but because it was the one time of year when family felt undeniable. You couldn't ignore it. You couldn't postpone it. It was a time of gathering, of warmth, of shared stories over mashed potatoes and cinnamon-sprinkled pies. And for me, it was always the season when I got to feel like a mother again. Every year since Ethan was born, I made the same cranberry loaf with orange zest and cloves the way he liked it. I set the table with cloth napkins even when it was just the two of us after his father passed. After he married Sophia, the tradition shifted slightly. I came to their house instead. I didn't mind. I just wanted to be there. So as December rolled in, I started preparing like always. I bought the good vanilla extract, pulled out the old family recipes, and even started knitting a scarf for Lily in her favorite color, lavender. I wasn't told a date yet, but I assumed the invitation would come. It always had. Maybe they were just busy. I wrapped Lily's present with extra care. A small music box, shaped like a carousel painted by hand, with tiny horses that danced when you turned the crank. Inside, I tucked a note that said, "To my little light, may your joy never fade." I imagined her squealing when she opened it, spinning the top while giggling with delight. That image kept me company as I baked, cleaned, and watched the calendar inch closer to Christmas. On the night of December 22nd, I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. Finally. But as soon as I read it, I felt the floor shift under me. "Hey, Mom, just a heads up. This year, Sophia really wants to keep Christmas just us three. We're trying to start our own family traditions. Hope that's okay. Let's catch up after New Year's." I read it twice. Then again, no invitation. No discussion. Just don't come. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe he'd follow up with, "Of course we'd still love to see you for dessert," or "Come by Christmas morning instead." But the minutes ticked by. Nothing else came. I sat down at the edge of my bed phone, still in hand, my heart pounding like it used to when I was a little girl caught doing something wrong. Only, I wasn't the one who'd done anything this time. Or had I? That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, watching shadows shift as cars passed outside. I kept thinking, what did I do? Was I too present, too eager, too me at 3 a.m.? I got up and padded barefoot to the living room. The lights on the tiny tree I'd decorated flickered softly. Beneath it sat the gift I had wrapped for Lily, a box of cookies I'd planned to bring, and the half-finished scarf I'd been working on. I picked up the scarf and ran my fingers over the stitches. A snag in the yarn caught my attention, a tiny imperfection that I hadn't noticed before. I unraveled 3 rows, then paused. It felt like a metaphor. All that effort, and with one careless loop, everything could unravel. I placed the gift and the scarf back in the closet. Closed the door gently. Stood there for a long moment. The next morning I went about my routine as usual. Oatmeal tea, checking the mail. But everything felt muted. The world was still spinning. People were still rushing to buy last-minute presents, and children were still giggling on the sidewalks. But for me, something had gone quiet inside. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not even Dorothy. Dorothy was my neighbor for the last 8 years. A widow like me, a bit younger, but with the same sharpness in her eyes and a wry smile that could cut through most moods. We often sat together on Sunday mornings, drinking coffee in her kitchen and gossiping about things that didn't matter. She was the kind of friend who knew how to read silence better than words. On Christmas Eve morning, she knocked on my door with a tin of peppermint bark. "I figured you'd already made some," she said. "But what's Christmas without excess?" I smiled and invited her in. She set the tin down and looked at me closely. "What is it?" she asked. No preamble. I hesitated. Then I told her. Not the whole thing. Just the message, the timing, the way it landed like a stone in my chest. Dorothy didn't react right away. She simply nodded, poured us each a cup of coffee, and then said gently, "You know, sometimes kids need space to grow. But that doesn't mean you have to shrink to make room for them." I didn't reply. I didn't know how to. She reached over, squeezed my hand. "You gave them everything, Florence. That doesn't mean you're nothing now." That night, I didn't try to wrap another gift or bake another loaf. I sat by the window and watched snow begin to fall. Light at first, then steady. The kind of snow that made everything outside look softer, quieter. Inside, I felt the ache of absence, but also for the first time the stirrings of something else. Resolve, maybe. Or the beginning of it. I wouldn't show up uninvited. I wouldn't beg for inclusion. But I also wouldn't disappear. Not yet. Because while they were planning a Christmas without me, they didn't know I had something else planned too. Something they couldn't see coming. Something that would remind them. Gently, but firmly. That I wasn't just a footnote in their story. I was the beginning of it. After Christmas Eve passed in silence, I woke the next morning to an emptiness I hadn't known could ache so deeply. The apartment was still. No scent of cinnamon or pine. No sound of a child's laughter echoing from the hallway. Just the faint hum of the radiator and the low creak of my bones as I shuffled toward the kitchen. I made tea without thinking, stirring honey into the cup the way I always had. 2 circles, then a slow figure 8. Rituals remain even when the people you made them for have gone. I sat by the window and watched a bird peck at the frozen edge of the balcony railing. My mind wandered. First to Lily, wondering if she liked the music box I'd left for her weeks ago, though I had no reason to believe she even received it. Then to Ethan. I imagined him at the dinner table the night before, carving the ham, smiling across to Sophia, unaware, or perhaps unmoved, by my absence. I told myself not to dwell, not to imagine things I couldn't change. But hurt doesn't obey commands. It lingers, where it's not welcome, settles into the chest like cold. Later that afternoon, I decided to clean. Not because the apartment needed it, but because my hands needed to move. I dusted the shelves, sorted through old photo albums, and finally made my way to the antique dresser in my bedroom. The one with the bottom drawer I hadn't opened in years. That drawer held pieces of a life long folded away: my wedding veil, our honeymoon postcards from Maine, a faded hospital band from the day Ethan was born. And, tucked between them, carefully wrapped in a pale blue envelope, was a letter. My husband's last. He had written it just days before he passed, when he knew he wouldn't be able to say everything in person. I hadn't read it in a long time. Maybe because it hurt too much. Maybe because I thought I had already memorized every word. But this time the words struck differently. Florence, I know you. I know the way you love, with your whole being. I know how much you've sacrificed, how much you've given without asking for anything back. But I also know this. You don't have to stay silent to be kind. You don't have to make yourself small to be loved. If you are hurting, speak. If you are being used, walk away. You have always been the heart of this family. Don't let anyone make you feel like a shadow. I read it once. Then again. The tears didn't come all at once. They built slowly, rising like a tide I'd held back for too long. When they finally fell, they weren't just about Christmas, or even Ethan. They were for every moment I'd told myself to be quiet, to endure, to wait for kindness that never came. I folded the letter and held it to my chest. Then I walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept my old journals. Most were filled with half-used pages, grocery lists, and forgotten resolutions. But one had a sturdy brown cover, still empty, still waiting. I opened it, dated the page, and began to write. At the top, I titled it plainly, "What I Gave, What They Took." Underneath, I began listing 6 200 roof repairs, $2 to $400 property taxes, $700 emergency vet bill when their dog swallowed a toy, $300 groceries when Sophia lost her job, $150 ballet lessons for Lily, countless nights babysitting. Then I turned to the next page, titled it, "What Was Said," and began writing the words that had stayed with me longer than they should have. She's always here. It's not really her place to decide that. Old-fashioned advice again. We want to start our own traditions. She doesn't get it. She means well, but she's kind of a burden. Each one felt like a pinprick. Together they formed a wound. But I didn't stop there. On the third page, I titled it, "What I Need to Remember." I am the one who taught Ethan how to tie his shoes. I am the one who read him stories when he couldn't sleep. I am the one who held his hand when he got rejected from his dream college. I am the one who stood at the back of his wedding chapel, watching my boy become a man, holding my breath with pride. I am not weak because I'm alone. I am not unwanted because they don't see my worth. I am not done yet. By the time I finished writing, the sun had dipped below the horizon. A soft golden light bathed the apartment, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift. Not in them, but in me. A voice I had forgotten, my own, had begun to speak again. And it didn't whisper. It spoke clearly, firmly, without apology. They didn't want a mother. They wanted a sponsor. They didn't value my presence, only my resources. I had mistaken their dependency for closeness. And in my longing to feel needed, I had ignored the signs that I was no longer loved, just tolerated. That night, I lit a candle beside my husband's photo. I whispered, "Thank you," not just to him, but to the part of myself that had finally stirred awake. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had clarity. And clarity, I've learned, is the first gift you give yourself when you're ready to stop surviving and start living. The voice in me was still soft, still fragile, but it was real. And it had waited long enough. The morning I called Charles Bennett, I wasn't sure he'd even remember me. It had been over a decade since my husband's passing, since we sat across from Charles in that quiet corner office and finalized the estate paperwork. Back then, Charles was younger, though, always calm with a patient voice and eyes that didn't flinch at difficult conversations. My husband had trusted him completely, which meant I did too. The receptionist remembered me. "Mrs. Hayes," she said gently. "We can fit you in tomorrow at 9, eh?" "Mum, Mr. Bennett said he'd like to see you personally." That evening I gathered everything. I wanted to be prepared, not because I feared judgment, but because I knew this wasn't going to be a casual visit. I pulled the property deed from my file cabinet, the one with my name printed clearly at the top. Then the utility bills, each one paid from my own account, month after month. I placed them in a manila folder, neat and organized like I used to prepare Ethan's school binders, before every new grade. Then came the will, our original one, the one my husband and I had drawn up together. It listed Ethan as our primary beneficiary. At the time, there had never been a question in my mind. Our son would inherit everything. He was our future. But as I looked at the page now, something inside me resisted. Not in bitterness, but in clarity. The next morning I dressed with care. A soft blue blouse, black slacks, a silver locket I hadn't worn in years. It held a photo of Ethan when he was 7. Missing teeth, joyful eyes, holding a paper airplane like it was treasure. I kept it close, not to remember the boy, but to remind myself of the love I had carried, the love I was now choosing to protect differently. Charles greeted me with a warm handshake and a kind smile. His hair was grayer, his posture more rounded, but his eyes were still steady. He gestured to a chair and offered tea. When we sat down, I placed the manila folder between us and opened it without a word. One by one, I slid the documents forward, the property deed, the stack of bills, the original will. He didn't rush. He glanced through each sheet, nodding occasionally, his brow furrowed in quiet attention. When he reached the will, he paused longer. "I remember drafting this," he said softly. "You and Daniel were so aligned. It was one of the most thoughtful estate plans I'd ever done." I nodded, my fingers folding in my lap. It was right, back then. And now I looked up at him, and for the first time in a long while, I let the truth leave my lips without sugarcoating it. "I don't want to hurt my son," I said. "But I can't keep letting him hurt me." Charles didn't blink. He just nodded once, then leaned back slightly. "You've come to the right place." He took out a legal pad and began jotting notes. "Let's start with the will." "Do you want to remove Ethan entirely?" I hesitated. "I don't want to punish him. That's not what this is about. But I also can't leave everything to someone who treats me like a stranger. I'd like to create a trust instead. For Lily. He looked up. Do you want the trust to be separate from her parents' control? Yes, I said immediately. I want Lily to have something, when she's old enough to understand where it came from. But I don't want Sophia touching a cent of it. And Ethan, not unless something changes. Drastically. He nodded again. We can structure it that way. A trust in Lily's name accessible at 25. Independent oversight. We'll keep Ethan's name out of it for now. You can always amend later. The next part was harder. I want to reclaim the house, I said, my voice lower. It's in my name. I paid every bill, every repair. They treat it like theirs, but they've never held a single piece of it legally. Charles raised an eyebrow, not in surprise but in confirmation. You want to serve a notice of termination? Yes, I said. But I don't want it to be vindictive. I need space. Distance. Control over what I built. I can have the paperwork drafted within 48 hours, he said. You'll need to sign and we'll serve them formally. You're entitled to 30 days' notice. No negotiation. I felt something strange rise in my chest. Relief, maybe. Or something close to it. Not joy. This wasn't joyful, but a kind of release. Like I'd been carrying a weight that was never mine to hold, and someone had finally offered to help me set it down. What about my bank accounts, I asked. My retirement was partially shared with Daniel. I'd like to ensure none of it can be accessed or requested by Ethan or Sophia. Charles made a quick note. I'll file for an updated designation of beneficiaries. We'll separate out anything you don't want associated with Ethan. Do you want a secondary heir in case something happens to Lily? I thought for a moment. Not yet. For now, I just want to make sure what's mine stays protected. Quietly. We went over the rest: healthcare proxies, powers of attorney, the finer details that no one thinks about until they have to. Charles never once questioned me. Never once made me feel like I was being petty or impulsive. He treated me like someone making a decision based on reason, not revenge. And that's exactly what I was doing. As we reached the end of the meeting, he looked at me with a softness I hadn't expected. You've given a lot, Florence, he said. You're not taking anything back. You're just choosing where it belongs. I nodded, feeling the truth of that settle into my bones. Before I left, I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope. I placed it on his desk. I'd like everything finalized by the evening of December 24th, I said. If possible. Charles looked at the envelope, then back at me. Planning a delivery? Something like that, I replied. He smiled gently. We'll make sure it's ready. Quietly. Professionally. And with the dignity you deserve. As I stepped out of his office and into the cold winter air, I took a deep breath. The sky was gray, the streets wet with slush. But for the first time in weeks, my lungs felt full. My spine straighter. My hands steadier. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was reclaiming what had been mine all along. Not just the house. Not just the money. But my voice. And no one, not even my own son, was going to silence it again. The night before Christmas Eve, I stood at my kitchen counter with a piece of red cardstock in front of me, the kind I used to make holiday cards with Ethan when he was a little boy. We used to cut them into snowflakes and reindeer gluing glitter and buttons onto folded paper until our hands were sticky and the floor sparkled for weeks. But this time there was no glitter. No stickers. Just a blank red envelope and the quiet ache of resolution. I had gathered everything I needed: the termination notice for the house legally prepared and notarized. The updated will signed and witnessed with clear instructions that Ethan and Sophia were no longer beneficiaries and that a trust had been established for Lily when she turned 25. A bank statement showing years of payments I'd made, mortgage installments, property taxes, utility bills, all from my own account without ever asking for a cent back. And then the hardest part, the letter. I sat down with a pen and a fresh sheet of stationery. It was cream-colored with a rose border, the kind I used only for the most personal notes. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote the salutation. Dear Ethan. Then I stopped. There's something unspeakably heavy about writing a letter to your child knowing it might be the last time you speak to them in a way they'll truly listen. Words are fragile. They can't undo years. But they can make a boundary clear. And for me, that was everything now. I began again. Dear Ethan, I have written and rewritten this letter in my head 1,000 times. I think for a long time I believed that if I just kept loving you enough, kept showing up, kept giving quietly, you'd eventually see me again. Not as an obligation, not as an intrusion, but as your mother. I thought that love, especially the kind that sacrifices without asking, would eventually be recognized. I was wrong. You've told me in your own ways, through silence, through absence, through messages that arrive too late, that I no longer have a place in your family. And now I've finally decided to listen. I am not writing this in anger, though there is hurt. I am not writing to punish you, though there are consequences. I am writing because I need to reclaim something I lost in the process of giving you everything myself. This envelope contains the necessary documents to transfer control of what I once gave freely and in good faith. The house is no longer yours to assume. The money I spent will no longer be offered without thanks. And the future you expected will now belong to someone else, someone who may one day understand the value of what is freely given. I used to want you to have a home. Now I only hope you come to understand what a home truly means. For Christmas. From Mom. I signed my name, just once with no flourish, and placed the letter on top of the other documents. Then I sealed them all into the red envelope and pressed a gold foil sticker on the flap, the kind Lily used to love placing on her drawings. For a moment I simply held it. It felt heavier than it was. Afterward, I turned to the kitchen and began making the apple pie. I didn't know if I'd even be allowed through the door, but I wanted to arrive with something familiar. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples had once meant comfort in that house. Maybe it still did for someone. As I sliced the apples, I thought of all the meals I'd prepared in their kitchen. Sundays when Sophia had morning sickness and couldn't stand the smell of garlic, nights when Ethan came home too late to cook, afternoons when Lily stood on a stool next to me giggling as she rolled dough with chubby fingers. The memories didn't make me sad. Not anymore. They were reminders of who I'd been, who I still was. When the pie was done and cooled, I packed it into a carrier and laid the red envelope flat beneath it. I chose a simple outfit, navy slacks, a cream sweater, the pendant with my husband's initials engraved on the back. I didn't need to look festive. I only needed to be steady. Before leaving, I stood by the mirror and looked at myself. Not to fix my hair, but to acknowledge the woman staring back. I whispered, "You're not invisible." Then I put on my coat and walked into the crisp winter air, pie in one hand, truth in the other. I didn't call ahead. I didn't text. I didn't knock when I arrived. I simply walked up the familiar path toward the house I had helped build, not with bricks or boards, but with quiet devotion and a lifetime of sacrifice. The lights were on. I could see silhouettes moving inside. Ethan at the stove, Lily dancing in her Christmas pajamas, Sophia setting the table with silver-rimmed plates. I paused before ringing the bell. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I was complete. The door opened after a few seconds. Ethan's face appeared. Surprised, then wary. "Mom," he said, confused. "What are you—" I held up the pie. "I won't stay," I said softly. "I just came to drop something off." Before he could answer, Sophia appeared behind him. Her eyes narrowed, jaw tightening. "We weren't expecting you," she said quickly. "I know," I replied. "I brought dessert." I stepped forward, gently, handed Ethan the pie, then pulled the red envelope from beneath the carrier and placed it on top. "This is for you," I said. "Merry Christmas." Sophia reached for the envelope, but Ethan stopped her. "What is this?" he asked. I looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "It's everything I should have said years ago." Then I turned and walked away, the snow beginning to fall in soft flakes behind me. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I didn't look back. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be included. I was choosing to walk forward, with my dignity intact and my heart finally in my own hands. And that red envelope. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't revenge. It was a gift. The last one I would ever give to a son who no longer knew what love looked like when it didn't come with a price. Christmas Eve came wrapped in silence. The kind of silence that no carol could cut through. I woke early, not from excitement, but out of habit. Made my tea. Watered the peace lily by the window. Sat for a long while staring at the sky that promised snow. I was supposed to feel sad. Maybe even heartbroken. But I didn't. I just felt done. Not numb. Not bitter. Just done pretending I didn't see what I had seen or feel what I had felt. At precisely 5:30 p.m. I buttoned my coat, picked up the pie I had made, and slipped the red envelope into my purse. Not for drama, not for spectacle, but for closure. The kind that doesn't come with shouting or revenge, but with truth. Quiet, heavy truth. I arrived just after 6. The driveway was already full. 2 cars, I didn't recognize one that I did. I parked down the street and walked slowly, each step crunching lightly in the snow. The porch light was on warm and golden. Through the window I could see movement. Shadows cast by candles' silverware clinking faintly against plates. Laughter in the distance. I lifted my hand and rang the bell. A moment later the door swung open. It was Sophia. She stared at me like I'd just stepped off a spaceship. "What are you doing here?" she blurted, her voice sharp. Behind her I could see a long table set for many. At least 10 guests. A full dinner in progress. I recognized a few of Sophia's friends, maybe colleagues, and an older woman who looked like her aunt. "I came to bring something," I said, holding up the pie gently. "I won't stay." She narrowed her eyes. We weren't expecting you." "I know," I said evenly. "But I'm here." For a moment she stood frozen in the doorway. Then reluctantly she stepped aside. I walked in the warmth of the house, hitting me like a memory I wasn't sure I wanted to relive. Ethan appeared from the dining room holding a wine glass. He looked at me, then quickly looked down at the floor. "Mom," he said, "not quite a greeting, not quite a reprimand." I smiled, even if my heart didn't move. "Ethan." Sophia turned toward the dining room and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "No need to get another plate." "She's not staying." A few heads turned. A couple guests looked politely confused. I ignored them. I walked over to the dining table and placed the pie down carefully on the end, next to a tray of roasted vegetables. Then, with both hands, I reached into my purse and pulled out the red envelope. I held it for a second, then slid it across the table toward Ethan. It landed beside his wine glass, a bright splash of red against white linen. "What's that?" Sophia asked, still standing behind me. Ethan picked it up slowly, eyeing it like it might explode. He opened it, hands slightly trembling. As he began to read, the room quieted. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations died down, replaced by a hush you could feel more than hear. His face changed with every line. First pale, then flushed, then something else. Something he tried to hide but couldn't. Shame. Sophia walked over, grabbed the paper from his hands. Scanned it. Her voice rose immediately, sharp and incredulous. "You're evicting us," she nearly shouted. "You're throwing us out. This is our house." I turned and met her eyes. "No," I said gently. "It's mine." Ethan stood frozen, unable to speak. Sophia, on the other hand, was just getting started. "You've lost your mind," she snapped. "We've lived here for years. Lily's whole childhood is in these walls." "I know," I said. "I paid for every one of those years. Every repair. Every bill. Every tax. You said it was a gift I did. When I thought I was family." She opened her mouth to say more, but I raised a hand. Not harshly, just firmly. The kind of gesture a mother uses when a child has gone too far. I turned to Ethan. He hadn't moved. His mouth opened, then closed again. The others at the table sat in stunned silence. A few guests shifted awkwardly in their chairs. One woman picked up her napkin and dabbed at her mouth, unsure whether to leave or wait for the storm to pass. "I didn't come here to make a scene," I said, my voice calm and low. "I came here to finish something." Sophia scoffed. "You came here to ruin dinner." "No," I replied. "That was already ruined the moment you told me I wasn't family." Ethan's eyes flicked up to meet mine. I held his gaze. "You said it in so many ways, Ethan. When you stopped inviting me. When you told me I was too much. When you let your wife speak for both of you and never once stood up for me. I never meant—" He started, but I shook my head. "It's all right. I heard you loud and clear." I stepped back from the table. The pie sat untouched. The red envelope, now open, its contents exposed. And my presence, finally, unmistakably, acknowledged. Sophia folded the papers roughly, nearly tearing them. "This is cruel," she said. "No," I answered. "Cruel is being erased by the people you raised. Cruel is giving and hearing nothing but silence in return. Cruel is waiting for an invitation that never comes, and then being told I've overstepped." I adjusted my coat and looked at Ethan one last time. "You said I wasn't family anymore. So I'm doing what any outsider would do. Respecting your wishes." I turned toward the door. Behind me, I heard Sophia mutter something under her breath. I didn't catch the words, and I didn't care to. For once, I wasn't there to respond. I wasn't there to please, to explain, to fix. I opened the door, stepped out into the cold night. The snow was falling gently now, soft flakes catching in my hair and coat. The world was quiet again, and this time I welcomed the silence. Not because I was alone, but because I had chosen it. Inside, they would read those papers again. They would talk, maybe argue, maybe scramble to find solutions. But none of that mattered now. I had said what needed to be said. I had disappeared from that dinner not in shame, but in clarity. I was no longer trying to earn a seat at a table that had forgotten who said it in the first place. I hadn't expected him to chase after me. That would have required courage or remorse or even a flicker of compassion. Ethan had none of those left. Not for me. I knew that the moment I stepped out into the falling snow and the door closed behind me without so much as a word. But what I didn't expect was the sound of that same door slamming open behind me as I reached the driveway. "Wait!" Ethan barked. I turned slowly. "You're not just going to walk in here, embarrass us in front of everyone, and think you can get away with it," he snapped, striding down the front steps. "You don't get to play victim and steal our home out from under us." I tilted my head slightly, not surprised. But not moved either. "It was never yours to begin with," I said. He opened his mouth to reply, but behind him another voice called out, "Is there a problem here, Charles Bennett?" He walked up the driveway, calmly dressed in his long navy overcoat, leather briefcase in one hand. His silver hair was slicked back, his steps deliberate. He looked like he'd just stepped out of a courtroom and into a storm he already knew how to handle. Ethan turned confused. "Who are you?" Charles extended a gloved hand. "Charles Bennett, legal counsel for Mrs. Hayes, and the official trustee for the Florence Hayes Living Property Trust, which currently includes this residence." Sophia had followed Ethan out by now, her heels crunching in the snow. "Wait, what? A trust?" "Yes," Charles replied without hesitation. "The home is under the ownership of Mrs. Hayes, held in a legal trust. Your name is not on the title. You've been living here rent-free at her discretion. That discretion has now legally ended." He opened his briefcase and pulled out 2 documents, identical sets of printed pages stamped signed and neatly clipped. "These are formal notices of termination. As per California Civil Code FAR 1946, you are being given 30 days to vacate the premises. After that, the trust will reassume full possession." Ethan's face turned red, the kind of red that doesn't come from cold, but from shame. He reached for the papers with trembling hands, barely reading them before looking back up at me. "You brought a lawyer to Christmas. I brought him to my house," I replied softly, "because I no longer felt safe in it." Sophia tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. For once, there was no snark, no clever remark. Just silence. Charles continued, "You will find in the documents an itemized summary of expenses paid by Mrs. Hayes over the past 7 years, including but not limited to roof repairs, taxes, utility bills, and medical assistance. These were not gifts. They were contributions with a presumed bond of mutual respect, which, according to her, has long since eroded." I said nothing. I didn't need to. Charles closed his briefcase. "This will be handled quietly if you cooperate. Otherwise, we'll proceed through formal channels. I don't think any of us want that." Ethan stepped back, stunned. 30 days, he muttered. "What are we supposed to do?" Sophia folded her arms, but even she didn't have an answer this time. Charles looked at me and I nodded. "That's all for tonight, Mr. Bennett," I said gently. He gave a respectful bow of the head. "I'll follow up after the holiday." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, disappearing into the quiet dark. I remained where I was standing on the driveway, watching my son struggle to form a sentence. "You're really doing this," Ethan finally said. "I already did," I replied. "You just didn't notice." We stood there staring at each other for a moment that felt like an entire season folding in on itself. Then I turned, walked to my car, and drove away. No slamming door, no teary goodbyes. Only quiet. That night I sat at my kitchen table, the lights dim my favorite mug between my palms. The heat from the tea warmed my fingers, but not my chest. Not yet. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. But I also didn't feel broken. I felt weightless. I signed the final papers Charles had left me, officially transferring temporary authority of the property into the trust. He would handle the legal logistics. Rent taxes, eviction notices if needed. I wouldn't have to lift a finger. For once, I wasn't cleaning up a mess. I wasn't explaining my decisions. I wasn't apologizing for wanting respect. I was simply letting go. As I sealed the envelope and placed it on the corner of the table, a deep breath escaped my lungs, one I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. I thought of Lily. I wondered if they would tell her anything. Would they say Grandma was mean, petty, unfair, maybe? But one day she'd grow up. She'd ask questions. She'd find the trust in her name. She'd read the letters I'd left behind. And she'd know the truth, that I had loved too deeply, given too much, and waited too long to say enough. That night, as the clock struck midnight, the house was silent, but not empty. It was full of something new. Not sadness, not anger, but space. Room for peace to finally grow. And that, to me, felt more like a Christmas gift than anything I'd ever wrapped in ribbon. The apartment wasn't much to look at on the outside. Just a pale yellow building tucked between a bookstore and a cafe, a 2-block walk from the boardwalk. The kind of place most people would pass by without noticing. But when I first stepped inside, keys still cold from the realtor's hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Breath. Not just air, but breath. The kind that fills your lungs without resistance, like the space itself was inviting you to finally take up room. The living room had one large window that looked out over a narrow alley, but if I craned my neck just right, I could see a sliver of ocean between 2 buildings. The kitchen was dated. Laminate countertops and cupboards that creaked. But I didn't mind. It wasn't a house I bought to impress anyone. It was a home I chose just for me. And it was mine. Every inch. No one rolled their eyes when I said I wanted lavender-scented candles in every room. No one questioned why I chose pale blue curtains or hung up the watercolor of the farmhouse where I grew up. No one sighed when I played Billie Holiday on the record player I picked up at a thrift shop downtown. The first piece of furniture I brought in was a sofa. Soft beige with wooden legs and a few scuffs on the back. But when I sat on it, it felt like exhaling. Like it had been waiting for someone who didn't mind imperfections. I threw a knitted blanket over the back and added 2 mismatched pillows. One had embroidered sunflowers. The other said, "You belong here." I smiled when I saw it in the shop. I hadn't known how much I needed those words until I read them. I unpacked slowly over the course of a week. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because for the first time I could take my time. I didn't have to work around someone else's schedule. I wasn't trying to make a place livable for a child or suitable for guests. I was building something gentle, something rooted. I planted lavender on the small balcony. Bought a second-hand armchair that sagged just a little too much but cradled my body like an old friend. Hung pictures of my late husband in the hallway. Not just the posed wedding portraits, but the ones where he was laughing, messy human. At night, I made tea and watched the ocean turn from gold to slate. And in the quiet, I began to speak to myself again. Not out loud, but inwardly. I told myself that I had done enough. That I was not forgotten. That survival was noble, but peace was sacred. On the 3rd evening in the new place, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first. But when I answered, a small voice whispered on the other end. "Grandma?" I sat up straighter. Lily. She didn't say anything for a second. Just breathed as if unsure whether she should have called. Then I told Mom I was brushing my teeth, but I just wanted to say hi. My throat tightened. "Hi, baby. I miss you. I miss you too." A pause. "Grandma, that pie you made last Christmas." The apple one. It was still the best. I don't care what Mom says. I let out a laugh soft and full of warmth I hadn't felt in so long. "Well, that's a high compliment," I said. I'll have to make another one soon." She giggled, and for a second I could picture her, curled up under her blanket phone pressed to her cheek, hair still damp from her bath. "Okay," she said. "Love you. Gotta go." And just like that, the line went dead. But the room didn't feel empty. It felt full. Not of people. Not of noise. But of something better. Hope. The next morning I wrote her a card. Nothing dramatic. Just a few lines, and a doodle of an apple pie in the corner. I told her how much I loved her laugh. How proud I was of her curious heart. I slipped it into an envelope, added a sticker of a smiling cat, and mailed it to the P.O. box. I still remembered by heart. I didn't know if she'd get it. But I knew she'd remember that someone had taken the time. A few days later, I hosted myself a small housewarming. Just me, a cinnamon candle, and a new pair of slippers. I made soup. I played old jazz records. I danced slowly in the living room, arms out like I was holding an invisible partner. And when the song ended, I bowed. Not to anyone watching, but to myself. Because for the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for permission to enjoy my own life. I didn't need someone to say, "You matter." I knew it. Every morning after that felt different. The air smelled of lavender and lemon cleaner. My feet didn't ache from walking on eggshells. My voice didn't shrink to make room for someone else's opinions. I smiled more. Laughed at dumb jokes in the newspaper. Let myself sleep in. Learned how to cook for one without it feeling lonely. Bought a lemon tree and named her Maggie. Some might say it was a small life. But for me, it was expansive. It was sacred. And it was mine. The room I didn't need permission to decorate had become a life I didn't need permission to live. And that more than anything felt like the beginning of everything. Charles greeted me with his usual calm the moment I stepped into his office. The same walnut desk, the same quiet hum from the heater in the corner. It had only been a few weeks since Christmas Eve, but it felt like lifetimes had passed. I had shed the last of the heaviness like an old coat that no longer fit. The Florence who stood in front of him now wasn't broken or lost. She was steady. Whole. Still healing. But not hurting. He rose and extended a hand. "Mrs. Hayes." I smiled. "Charles, please. You've seen me at my worst. I think we're past formalities." He chuckled and gestured for me to sit. The paperwork was already neatly stacked in front of him. Manila folder. Tabs marked with bright blue stickers. He was always organized, always precise. Qualities that had given me comfort during this long process. "We're ready to finalize," he said. "I've reviewed the draft of the trust for Lily. Do you want to go over it again before you sign?" I nodded and took the pages in my hands. It outlined everything I had asked for: a secure financial trust set aside exclusively for Lily, accessible only after she turned 25 with oversight from a neutral third party. It couldn't be accessed by her parents. Not Ethan. Not Sophia. Only Lily. Only when she had grown enough to decide what home, love, and legacy meant on her own. I included the clause about educational support and life counseling. Charles added gently. "Just like you asked." "Thank you," I said. I flipped to the final pages and signed one line at a time. My hand didn't shake. My pen didn't pause. When I finished, he passed me the will. "This is the updated document," he said. "It distributes the remainder of your estate. The apartment, your investments, any personal assets. It still lists Lily as the primary beneficiary of the trust, of course." I nodded again. "There's also the charitable section," he continued. "You've allocated a portion to the Willowbrook Community Center. I smiled at that. After everything they've done for me, it's the least I could do. I want other women, mothers like me, to have a place to land when everything else falls away. Charles gave a small, approving nod. It's a good thing, Florence. Then he cleared his throat and lifted the final sheet. There's just one last decision. Do you want to remove Ethan entirely? The question hung in the air. I stared at the page in front of me. It was just ink. Just paper. But it carried the weight of decades. His name written there in black and white was so familiar. It looked like it belonged. But that was the lie, wasn't it? That just because something had always been there meant it should stay. I closed my eyes briefly. I want his name gone from the documents, I said slowly. But not from my heart. Charles didn't speak. I'm not erasing him from my life. I'm just no longer pretending he deserves parts of it. He's never respected. I folded my hands on the desk. I will always be his mother. That doesn't change. But love, real love, doesn't mean allowing someone to walk through your heart with muddy boots. I've loved him up close. I've loved him through pain. Now I'm choosing to love him, from afar. Charles's expression didn't change, but I saw the way he exhaled. Softly, as if understanding something deeper than law. I'll make the adjustment, he said. Before I left, I pulled a second envelope from my purse. Cream-colored. Handwritten. This isn't for you, I said. But I want you to keep it safe just in case something happens to me. He took it carefully. May I ask what it is? A letter for Lily. For when she's old enough. I didn't cry as I handed it over. I'd cried when I wrote it. Every word had been weighed. Every sentence a quiet offering of truth. I had written it late one night, sitting at the little desk in my new apartment, the window open to the cool breeze. I had lit a candle. I had prayed. Not to undo what had happened, but to plant something better. In that letter, I told Lily who I really was. Not the version her parents may have painted, but the woman who had rocked her to sleep, read her fairy tales, kissed her scraped knees, and showed up even when she wasn't asked. I told her what a home truly meant. Not a building. Not a house with nice furniture and Instagram-perfect decor. But a place where you are wanted. Safe. Seen. I told her I hoped she would build that kind of home one day. Not just for herself, but for others. And I told her to never confuse silence for strength. That love should never cost her her self-worth. That kindness should never mean erasing herself. I didn't blame her parents. I didn't fill the letter with poison. I simply told her the truth. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away with your dignity intact. I stood to leave. Charles rose with me. Thank you, I said, for handling this with grace. Thank you, he replied, for showing that strength doesn't always roar. Outside, the day was cold, but clear. A gentle sun spilled over the sidewalk, catching in the frost on the trees. I walked slowly back to my car, clutching my coat around me. There was no dramatic ending. No camera to pan away. Just a woman who had learned that you could rewrite the story even if the first chapters had gone terribly wrong. And somewhere, years from now, a young woman named Lily would read a letter. And she'd know. She'd know her grandmother hadn't disappeared. She had simply chosen to live in peace. And to love. From a distance that finally allowed her to breathe. Last Christmas, I stood in a room full of people and realized I had never felt more invisible. This Christmas, I stood alone and felt entirely seen. I woke early on Christmas morning to the quiet hum of the heater and the soft scent of cinnamon and cloves wafting through my apartment. I'd set everything the night before tea lights on every windowsill, a wreath I made from eucalyptus branches and dried oranges, and the radio tuned to the classical station playing old Christmas hymns. It was just me. And it was more than enough. I slipped into my robe, padded across the warm floor, and started the kettle. There was no chaos, no forced smiles, no tension hovering beneath forced conversations. There was only peace. The kind of peace I used to think would come after everyone else was happy. But now I knew better. I poured my tea, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and curled up on the sofa. My favorite wool socks, thinned at the heels, but still warm, hugged my feet. And in my lap was a small package I'd saved to open until morning. It had arrived 3 days ago. No return address, just my name written in soft purple ink. The handwriting was unmistakably Lily's. I opened it slowly. Inside was a card handmade on folded watercolor paper. The front was painted with a Christmas tree, slightly lopsided, but vibrant with green and specks of glitter. At the base of the tree was a single candle, glowing yellow. And next to it a note in uneven lettering that made my throat tighten the moment I read it. "You are the light I never want to lose." Inside the card she'd drawn the two of us holding hands, our stick figure faces smiling under a starry sky. No words. Just that. And it was more than enough. I placed the card gently on my small mantel beside the photo of Daniel and the clay ornament Lily had made in kindergarten. My little corner of memories. A patchwork of joy, sorrow, and everything in between. I had sent her a package, too. A soft scarf I crocheted in her favorite color, wrapped with care, and tucked beside a children's book I used to read her the snowy day. Inside the book I had placed a letter. Not long. Just enough. Enough to say, "I see you. I love you. I will always be here." I knew Ethan hadn't seen her open it. I didn't expect he ever would. It had been nearly a year since he spoke to me. After that night there were no apologies. No phone calls. Just silence. Sophia had moved out a few months after Christmas. Rumors of trouble had started swirling through neighbors and friends. I hadn't asked. I didn't need to know the details. I didn't feel satisfaction about it. Only distance. Distance was no longer a wound. It was space to breathe. I'd learned something in the months that followed, that silence, once used as a weapon, could become a boundary. That not being invited wasn't the same as being forgotten. And that healing didn't require anyone else's permission. Around noon, I cooked a small Christmas lunch. Rosemary chicken, mashed sweet potatoes, and a small apple tart. I set the table for one but used my best dishes. The ones I used to bring out only for guests. I lit 2 candles. Not for show, but because I deserved light. I poured myself a glass of cranberry punch and raised it gently in the air. To presents, I whispered. Not presents. After lunch, I took a long walk along the boardwalk. The sky was soft gray clouds hanging like heavy cotton, but the sea still shimmered beneath it. A few families were out, bundled in scarves, children laughing as seagulls chased their crumbs. I didn't feel envy. I felt gratitude for the rhythm of the tide, the sound of my footsteps, the warmth of my breath. When I returned home, I slipped into a warm bath, classical music echoing softly from the radio. And when the sun set, I didn't feel the pang I used to feel, that ache of being left out. Because no one could leave me out of a life I had finally claimed as my own. I read a book by the firelight, wrote a page in my journal, lit another candle for Daniel and one for the woman I used to be, the one who waited by the phone, who baked pies in hopes of gratitude, who tried so hard to earn what should have been freely given. I whispered a quiet thank you to her. She had carried me this far. And when I finally lay in bed, the silence didn't sting. It wrapped around me like the softest blanket. That night, I dreamed not of the past, but of the future. Of a time when Lily would walk through my door on her own, not as a child, tucked behind her parents, but as a woman who understood what it meant to be seen, to be loved, to choose peace over approval. And maybe, just maybe, she would bring a pie of her own. But even if she didn't, I would still be whole. Because this Christmas, no one invited me to dinner. And for the first time, I didn't need anyone's invitation to belong. If you've ever sat at a table feeling invisible, if you've ever been told directly or silently that you no longer belong, then maybe like me you've had to learn the strength it takes to walk away with your dignity intact. Have you ever given everything to someone only to realize they stopped seeing your worth? What did you do when love wasn't returned with respect? I'd love to hear your story, because these stories aren't just mine. They're ours. If this touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss another story of quiet strength, deep healing, and the kind of revenge that comes from reclaiming your peace. You are not alone. You were never invisible.